This is Joel Kotkin.
And this is Marshall Toplansky.
And you're listening to the Feudal Future podcast. Our society is being rapidly reduced to a feudal state, a process now being exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Millions of small businesses are near extinction. Millions more are losing their jobs, and many others will be stuck in the status of propertyless serfs. The big winners have been the expert class of the clerisy, and most of all, the tech oligarchs, who benefit as people rely more on algorithms than human relationships.
With this, around the world, the middle class is becoming more squeezed than ever, and it's having profound economic, social, and spiritual implications. Here on the show, we're having conversations with business, government, and citizen leaders like you to get to the core of these issues and explore how we can work together to form a better future than the one we're headed towards. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we are going to focus in on one of the crucial issues of the day, which is the minimum wage. It's being debated right now. There's obviously a lot of politics involved with the whole discussion. And today, we've asked two prominent economists to join us to focus on the economics side. So let me first introduce Michael Strain. Michael is is from American Enterprise Institute and in charge of policy research. And Rob Scott is from the Economic Policy Institute. So we have both sides of the political spectrum covered. And gentlemen, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
We're glad you're here. So let me just tee up the kind of question we want to focus on in a general sense, which is when you're looking at the minimum wage, leaving aside the political discussions, from an economic point of view, how pressing is the need for a minimum wage adjustment, and how heavy is the burden really on employers to fund it? Rob, you want to start us off?
Okay, good. So just want to provide some context and talk about our estimates of what the minimum wage will do and why it's needed. If we look historically, first slide, we're today living through the longest period in history without an increase in the federal minimum wage. For context, the federal minimum wage today is, as the slide says, 17% less than it was 10 years ago, and 31% less than it was in 1968. That was the actual peak and the real value of the minimum wage, which in 2019 dollars was at that time $10.54. It's fallen over $3 an hour in the intervening what is it, nearly 40 years now since the wage peaked. I want to put up one other slide here for context. We've seen tremendous increases in productivity growth and income and wages that have gone to most workers in the economy, but not those who are earning the minimum wage. Well, who are those workers? Next slide tells us who would get a benefit from a boost in the minimum wage. In our estimate, we've got models to show this. There are 35 million who would benefit. People often suggest that it's mostly teenagers, but in fact that's not the case. There are 9.4 million parents, 19.5 million women, nearly 20 million full-time workers, and 30 million adults out of the 33 who are 20 years or older. So the vast majority of the minimum wage beneficiaries are of age.
Rob, let me just jump in and ask a quick question. So who isn't covered under the minimum wage? For instance, we've seen tremendous amount of increase here in California in the number of restaurant and hospitality workers, obviously pre-COVID, but are they covered under the minimum wage increases?
Thank you. Excellent question. Today, they are not. Today they get a sub minimum wage of, I think, about $2.28 an hour plus tips if they're so lucky as to get them, although they don't get very much in tips these days. This raise, this proposed, the one that was proposed in the current relief bill that's being debated in the Congress would have gradually eliminated the sub minimum wage. So it was given a sub minimum wage to all workers. So the bottom line, who is this? These are 33.5 million workers. That's actually almost 23% of the labor force, plus workers who earn a little bit more than the minimum wage. They're included in that figure, but it's a substantial share, the bottom of the labor force, essentially the bottom quintile of the labor force.
Great.
Michael, in the discussion.
I'd love to turn it over to Mike to Michael to see what his thoughts are about the numbers you just showed. Any issues there, Michael?
Well, I think these numbers are all reasonable. These, I would probably come to some slightly different conclusions, but I don't think that there's really any doubt that when the minimum wage goes up, that workers' wages go up. And that's something that my own research has demonstrated. I'm not aware of a single study that tests the opposite. When the minimum wage goes up, people more income. The Congressional Budget Office estimated the effects of increasing the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, and they concluded that 27 million workers would see their income go up as a consequence of that minimum wage increase. I think Rob's number was 33. These are very much in the same ballpark, and reasonable differences in modeling can come to different conclusions. That is one part of the story. How minimum wages would affect the labor market. Of course, there are many other outcomes we'd be worried about. It wouldn't be as good as seeing incomes go up. And I assume you'll want to get to some of that discussion at some point.
Well, in fact, I'd like
conversation,
but sooner rather than later. I just want to pick up on what the slide is that Rob has up, which is basically showing that productivity looks like what you're trying to prove here is that productivity has gone up as the minimum wage has stayed.
It's actually stagnated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really the point. This was a missing slide I couldn't find a moment ago, which shows that the average worker's wage has now increased to roughly, I have it on another screen here so I can actually read it, to about $18.67 an hour. If it just had gone up with productivity, but as we mentioned earlier, it's actually gone down $3 an hour.
Got it. So does this imply, and this is going to kind of bridge us a little bit to the whole issue of employers funding it, but does this imply that the stagnant minimum wage has actually been driving productivity?
I would certainly not argue that. I think it's largely been distributional over the last 40 or 50 years, especially since 1979. We'd seen a huge increase in the share of income going to top 20, 10, especially 10 and 1% of the income distribution. And one of the ways those at the top have captured more income is by putting it crudely, they're exploiting workers at the bottom and paying them less. And the shrinking value of the minimum wage lets them do that. Those workers at the bottom have very little market power to bid up their wages. That's why we need a regulation, which is what the minimum wage is, to help increase their wages.
Michael, what do you think about that? Do you think that's accurate?
Well, I certainly don't think that a stagnant minimum wage has fueled productivity increases. I mean, I think you could actually make a reasonable argument that it's been the opposite.
Exactly.
If you think about what the minimum wage does, it kind of raises the minimum productivity level of the workforce. So, right now, you have a whole bunch of workers who are earning the minimum wage, $7.25 an hour. And those workers are of lower productivity than workers who are earning $15 an hour. If you measure productivity as revenue generated per hour of work, which is a very reasonable way to measure it, you are allowing, by having a lower minimum wage, a whole bunch of lower productivity workers into the workforce. So if we were to raise the minimum to 15, I would expect to see, if anything, I would expect to see productivity for the economy as a whole to go up.
Absolutely. Firms operate on let's digress into economics here, a production possibility frontier where they can substitute capital for labor. And so if we raise the price of labor at the bottom, then we can expect that firms are going to invest more, which is a good thing, and that will raise productivity in the economy. And further, we know that if we look at Europe, where they have much higher minimum wages than we do in the United States, as high as $25 an hour or more, they have much higher productivity levels in service industries. And so that, I think, just confirms what we're finding in this discussion.
So is that, just to make sure that our viewers understand this, are you saying then that as the cost of labor goes up, that the desire to replace labor with automation through investment goes up? Will we see fewer and fewer people employed?
Am I saying that?
No, I'm just wondering if that's what the argument was from Rob, that we're seeing investment occur as the cost of labor goes up, in essence replacing labor with automated processes. Is that something that we would expect to see?
I think you'll see fewer workers at your neighborhood McDonald's per hamburger. Mm-hmm. I think productivity will rise. I think, though, that's what we would call, again, digress to economics, that's a partial equilibrium result. Mm-hmm. The overall effect on the demand for labor in the economy is going to depend on a number of factors. For example, we talked about that investment. Somebody's going to have to make those machines for McDonald's to sell those hamburgers more automatically. And so that will create jobs in the hamburger machine producing industry. So that's a good thing. And those jobs generally are higher wage jobs. They're in manufacturing. So there will be many changes in the structure of the economy. Michael, you agree or?
Well, sure. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I would also expect to see fewer people working in the local McDonald's, and I would expect to see McDonald's investing relatively more in technology that can do the same kinds of tasks that today's minimum wage workers are doing, and I think that has positive aspects for the economy as a whole. I think it does. I mean, to answer your question more directly, I do think it would result in less among the lowest wage, skilled, least experienced group of workers, and so in my mind, this is a trade-off. In the Congressional Budget Office, there would be 1.4 million fewer jobs as a consequence of a $15 an hour minimum wage. That's about 0.9% less employment if memory serves. I think that's a reasonable estimate. I think you could quite easily see more than 2 million jobs disappear. I think you could see more than 3 million jobs disappear. There are a variety of reasons why I think the CBO estimate might be lower than what we would actually see. And so that's the downside. The upside is that you have 27 million, or to take Rob's number, 33 million people who get a raise, and you accelerate some of these productivity increasing decisions by businesses by lowering the relative cost of investing in labor saving technology.
But I'd like to bring up an issue that's ancillary to what I'll start with this one. One of the things that happened at the last year, before the pandemic, there was some increase in the incomes of poorer workers. We're seeing a little bit better results, Latinos, African Americans, which was, I thought, probably if Trump had anything to brag about, that was probably as good a thing as any. But here's a question. Jared Bernstein at EPI, among others, has made the point that if we are moving to essentially opening the borders or increasing the amount of immigration, would that also have a depressing effect on the wage rates and make it harder for this kind of policy to work? Because if you have, let's say, if we go here in Southern California and 100,000 people from Central America with minimal skills come here, and there aren't many jobs for them, and they're crowding the labor market, it may make it harder because the goal isn't the minimum wage, the goal is to raise incomes. So Rob and Mike, is this immigration issue something that really impacts the long-term effects of minimum wage and income growth?
I'd like to put that aside for a moment and come back to it if we could. I don't have how much time we have, because I think it's an interesting question, but I think we got to focus on the jobs question first. Just to respond to Michael's point, I want to put some context on the jobs issue and the minimum wage in two ways. First, we had to contrast the benefits. The CBO study that he referred to showed that there's going to be an enormous amount of income transferred to these lowest income workers, the bottom 20% of the labor force. Their estimate was, I think, $333 billion over the next 10 years, $33 billion a year going to low wage workers. It's going to provide tremendous amounts of relief and real benefits for families and children. Our estimates are somewhat larger. We think it's closer to 80 billion than 30 billion a year. But secondly, on this jobs question, and again, this touches on the issue of immigration, our estimates are that, in fact, according to the best available latest technology estimates from the from leading researchers, Aaron Dubé at Berkeley has surveyed this research and shown that the best available estimate is that the net effect of the minimum wage on employment is essentially zero. And that's because it's the combined effect of two forces. One, the minimum wage will cause substitution into capital, as we've discussed. So that will tend to reduce employment. But on the other, it will also raise the incomes of all those families, as we've just discussed. They will have more money to spend, and those workers spend all of that money. So it would create more demand for goods and services. So studies, for example, of increases in the minimum wage at the state level, which compare one state to another, which rate one raises its rate, one does not, show no significant change in job creation rates. And finally, that 1.4 million figure from the CBO, that was a number of jobs to be created in their estimate over 10 years. So we're looking at most 140,000 jobs a year, and this amongst a labor force of 35 million people. And oh, by the way, there's tremendous turnover amongst minimum wage workers. These people don't stay in the same job for long periods of time. They move around looking for better living. So the impact in terms of employment is going to be imperceptible for most workers.
Michael?
It sounds great, right? It sounds like, there's a nice linear function here that we have, the two things work against it. But what about the issue of businesses going out of business because they can't afford this, and having the potential energy of jobs being reduced because there's employers are getting picked off in all of this? What's your sense about that?
Well, let me just go back to what Rob said before I address that. I mean, I think this is a point of real disagreement. I certainly agree with Rob that there are some very high quality studies that have been done that conclude that minimum wage really aren't associated with anything more than negligible reductions in employment. In my view, there are also some really good studies that come to the opposite. And so I think there's debate about this among economists. What's somewhat unusual about the minimum wage that not only is there debate within the literature about what the effects of minimum wages are, but there's debate about what the literature says as a whole also. It's a surprisingly complicated question, and it's an important question. And so I think there are reasonable people on both sides of this. In my view, the weight of the evidence really does suggest that there are job losses from minimum wage increases. Two economists just in the last few weeks looked at every paper that have been published in the last 30 years on the minimum wage, and they reached out to the authors of those papers and said, tell me the best estimate in your paper for what happens when the minimum wage goes up to employment. And my recollection is something like 80% of those papers found employment reductions. And so that's a lot. And the share of papers that find employment reductions actually isn't decreasing over time. So according to this, it's not the case that economists 20 years ago used to think this. And, that's and the literature suggests that's less true these days. In my own research on this topic, I find that that small increases in the minimum wage have relatively small employment reductions associated with them. Certainly not large reductions in employment. But I find that the larger the increase in the minimum wage, the bigger the effect is on employment. And so when I think about the question of taking the minimum wage to 15, that is not a modest increase. That would more than double the federal minimum wage. The current minimum is $7.25, so doubling it would get you to $14.50, and we're talking about 15. There are many states that still have a $7.25 minimum wage, and 15 is high. There are 3 states where half of all workers earn less than $16.50. There are 20 states where half of all workers earn less than $18. And so you're really talking about a minimum wage that is going to affect a huge share of the workforce in some of these lower wage states. I think the debate about what the existing evidence on the minimum wage shows is actually not super relevant to this policy question. In American history, we typically have had modest minimum wage increases. And that's certainly, the evidence from studying those modest increases is certainly helpful in trying to ascertain what would happen if we more than doubled the federal minimum wage. But I would expect that the job losses associated with going to 15 would be significantly larger than what the evidence base suggests, just because that minimum wage increase is so much larger than what the U.S. has experienced in the past.
Rob, please feel free to respond.
Yes, I appreciate it. Marshall, you asked earlier about the businesses closing. My maybe response was, "Oh, creative destruction! How terrible!" As economists, I think we would applaud. And again, I think there will be some firms that will have to either go out of business or invest and innovate and do things differently. But there will be new jobs created, as I said, in manufacturing, in machines that make hamburgers, and so on. So I think that's a that's a good thing. In terms of how fast the minimum wage should go up, we're talking about a period here of between 4 and 5 years. If we pass the minimum wage today, it will go up about $1.50, 5 times. And I don't think it's going to be disruptive. We have to keep in mind, I think you talked about this earlier, the fact that that the economy tends to do best for workers at the bottom when it's heating up. And on the one hand, we are in the worst economy that we've seen in probably 75 years right now. We've got 75 million workers at the bottom, these same workers, and I have some charts on that too, who have been devastated by the COVID recession, while those at the top are doing great. I think that it appears now that with the $1.9 trillion relief bill that the Senate appears poised to pass, and I'm sorry, I'm getting back into politics, but it seems to be where the economy is headed, and with the climate and infrastructure bill that President Biden is teeing up next, which could come to $2 or $3 trillion, at least as initially discussed. That's going to inject a lot of spending into the economy. And there's also a lot of pent-up savings in the economy. So there's going to be demand for goods and services. So we could be on the verge of a very hot recovery. And so I think that's an ideal time to talk about a phased-in, strong increase in the minimum wage to help workers who have been, after all, those who have borne the brunt of this downturn. I mean, it's Black and brown workers who have suffered much more than those college-educated workers of all races, and they are the ones who've got the highest rates of unemployment today. So this is, I think,
Michael, do you share that optimistic view of the economy? Because obviously that would make minimum wage increase much less of a problem.
Oh, yeah, I do. I mean, I think that we're going to have a good year here in 2021. I don't think that there's really much doubt about that. In fact, I'm worried. I am more worried about the economy growing too quickly than I am about the economy growing too slowly over the course of 21, assuming that President Biden's stimulus proposal passes, which I think it will.
You're worried about reheating inflation.
Yeah, I'm worried it'll push the economy too far too quickly, and I'm worried about the Fed attempting to pump the brakes on that, and I'm worried about that hurting the workers who Rob is talking about. I mean, I think what we learned from the Great Recession, and I have a new paper on this actually, Rob, that we use some EPI data for some of the calculations. Which of course we acknowledge in the paper, but what we show in this paper is that the recovery for about half of workers from the Great Recession didn't really begin until 2014. Right. And if you actually look at wages in the bottom half of the wage distribution, what you saw was that relative to 2007. Relative to when the Great Recession began, workers in the bottom half were actually seeing their wages drop all the way up until 2013, 2014. And so if the recovery from the Great Recession had ended in 2014, 5 years after the recovery began, I mean, that wouldn't have been a especially short recovery. Then about half of all workers would have actually ended that recovery in a worse place than they were in before the Great Recession began. Now, fortunately, things turned around, and the hot economy and tight labor markets really did boost the wages of workers up and down the wage distribution, including workers in the bottom 20%, so that when the pandemic began, those workers were in much better shape than they were in prior to the Great Recession. Yes, I think that Rob is right about the importance of a hot economy, and I think Rob's right about his forecast for 2021. I would be much more comfortable with a minimum wage increase that began in 2022, let's say, because I do think that the labor market in 2021 is still going to be weak. It's going to be improving, but it's not going to be strong or tight. And my reading of the evidence is that minimum wage increases that occur during weak labor markets result in more job loss than those that occur in
right. I understand the logic of where you're coming from. Let me, since we're coming up to the end of our time, let me pivot to one more question. I know this is one of Joel's favorite topics, but really let's look at the minimum wage as a social safety net feature in a larger sense. If you kind of buy into the creative destruction argument that Rob was starting to promulgate, maybe you could make the argument that the whole economy is moving into an entirely different set of levers that are going to be defining it, right? That we're moving into a world defined by AI, by machine learning, and we're obviously just kind of taking the early steps on that. And maybe this doesn't get played out for another 20 years, but is minimum wage the right lever, the right program to really focus in on?
Or are there other?
Do we need to really be thinking about UBI?
Right.
What do you guys think about that?
Or reshoring industry, and any of those? What do you think are the priorities to get to where we want to go, which is to increase the wages of working class people?
Well, I'm a technological optimist, and if you look at the data, again, it suggests that in fact the United States does not have particularly high rates of automation. We have amongst the lowest levels of robot investment, in terms of robots per worker in the developed world. So I think we're actually behind the curve there. We need more investment. We need more productivity growth, and that will be good for workers. It will generate gains in the economy that can be fairly shared. In my view, we need more regulations on the economy in order to shift more income to workers. Certainly the minimum wage is one of those. My colleague Josh Bivens, who's our research director at EPI, just had an op-ed this morning on CNN that argued for a financial transaction tax to dampen excessive financial speculation. In fact, and to go back to the minimum wage for a moment, in terms of who pays, this is one of the questions you raised earlier. The CBO study showed, I believe, that most of the negative impacts on income would fall on those in the top few percent of the economy. I think it was people earning above $228,000 a year would see a slight fall in their income. That's where the income comes from to pay the extra $33 million a year to those workers in the bottom. So regulation can guide the economy, I think, in better directions for workers. And we certainly also want to see more unionization, et cetera. I also am a big promoter of rebalancing trade. You talk about reshoring, and I think that's another discussion we can have on another day.
Michael,
what do you think?
What's your suggestion?
Well, so I disagree with Rob about a lot of that, but I agree with Rob about technological optimism. I mean, I'm also a technological optimist. I think the right question to ask is, what is the goal of raising the minimum wage? I think that question isn't asked often enough. If the goal of raising the minimum wage is to boost the incomes of the middle class, then the minimum wage is a policy that accomplishes that goal reasonably effectively. And I think Rob's right that some upper income people are paying part of that price. In my view, you're going to see a large number of employment reductions. So they're bearing the burden of some of that also. But 30 million people get a raise and 2 million people lose their jobs. I mean, this is something that we can debate. But if the goal instead is to help the working poor, if the goal instead is to advance a society where no one who works full time and heads a household lives in poverty, then I think the minimum wage is even less advisable policy to pursue. And the reason for that, of course, is that the minimum wage will boost a lot of incomes, but the overwhelming majority of the people whose incomes will rise are people who don't live in poverty. And the reason for that is that the minimum wage workers on the whole don't live in low income households. Households are low income because they're not working for the most part. The share of people who work full time year round and who live in poverty is really quite low. And so I think the question then becomes, if your goal is to help the working poor, does eliminating 1, 2, 3 million jobs for low wage workers make sense in the service of that goal when the beneficiaries of the policy are not households with poverty? And I think the answer to that is no. We have better policies to help. A important policy is the earned income tax credit, which I know Rob supports. The earned income tax credit is an earning subsidy. So the federal government says, okay, you make 20 grand a year in the labor market, we're going to give you an extra 5. And so it helps to make work pay. Every year it lifts millions of workers out of poverty, including millions of households, out of poverty, including several million children. Unlike the minimum wage, it is targeted on low-income households. So the minimum wage is agnostic as to the household income of the worker. The earned income tax credit is targeted really effectively on low-income households. And unlike the minimum wage, the earned income tax credit actually increases employment by drawing low-income Americans into the workforce. I think the question of who pays is important, and that's a good important factor in this specific issue as well. The minimum wage says, okay, you don't want people who work full time and head households to live in poverty. The burden of ensuring that people who work full time and head households don't live in poverty should fall on their employers. It should also fall on the customers of those businesses because prices go up. What I find attractive about the earned income tax credit is that it doesn't let everybody else off the hook. I think that McDonald's should have responsibility to make sure McDonald's workers are paid wages. But if we want to make sure McDonald's workers don't live in poverty, everybody on the hook for that goal, not just McDonald's. You're leaving hedge funds off the hook, lawyers, doctors, economists, all these people you're saying don't share in that social responsibility. The nice thing about the EITC is that it's an income redistribution program. And so you are requiring that all of society contribute to making sure that people who work full time aren't living in poverty. And I think that is a desirable feature of any sort of anti-poverty policy.
Well, guys, this has been fascinating. I wish we had the time to keep this going for a couple of hours because I'm really enjoying the conversation, looking at the alternatives to minimum wage, looking at the debates about what the impact of minimum wage is. I just want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your points of view today.
And I just want to add, first of all, obviously, I'm very grateful that we're doing that you were able to do this, but I find the tone and the fact that you guys have areas of agreement. I just wish that our Congress people would act like human beings the way you guys are and trying to say, okay, we disagree on this, we agree on that. If the only thing that's going to save this republic is if we get rid of the current Congress people and we put you guys in there.
Replace all the lawyers. I like that.
That's right. Well, if you don't shoot them, at least you can replace them, right?
Exactly.
Well, guys, thank you for being part of the Feudal Future podcast. And hopefully we can continue this in a future episode. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.